Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about All Stories Are Anansi's, which is a Ghanaian folk tale, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. This version was translated by Harold Corlander and Alfred Kofi Prempa. And basically, Anansi's stories are really interesting because they are a kind of truly global approach to folklore. Anansi originates in West Africa, probably with the Ashanti, who are indigenous to what's now Ghana. But then Anansi's stories spread. They spread throughout West Africa into different West African cultures. Through slavery, they spread into the Caribbean, into South America, Central America, North America, into Europe through the importation of slaves and the trafficking of enslaved people, etc., etc. And Anansi changes over time and in different places for different purposes. But because Anansi is myth, is folklore, Anansi also changes within the context of Ghana itself, within the context of Ashanti culture, because this is the way that myth and folklore works, right? Is the purpose of these stories changes. But generally speaking, what folklore is usually intended to do, in the broadest brushstrokes sense terms, is to teach some kind of moral lesson. And All Stories Are Anansi's is no exception to this. So Anansi is a spider, basically. Anansi tends to be quite cunning, tends to be quite greedy. Anansi is up for not being the largest, the strongest, the most physically powerful creature by being smart. And that's one of the central characteristics of Anansi, generally across the stories. Often Anansi is quite successful, particularly in African myths and folk tales, whereas in, say, North American, Caribbean, South American, Anansi is less likely to be successful. But in this story, All Stories Are Anansi's, Anansi achieves his aims. So, it starts out here. In the beginning, all tales and stories belong to Nyame, the sky god. But Kwaku Anansi, the spider, yearned to be the owner of all the stories known in the world, and he went to Nyame and offered to buy them. So what we've got right off the bat, right, is this figure of greed. Anansi wants to own all of the stories. And he thinks of them as something that can be bought. And interestingly enough, he's not wrong about this. Nyame does say, I will sell you all of the stories in exchange. He says the price will be high, right? My price is three things, the sky god said. I must first have Momboro, the hornets. I must then have Onini, the great python. I must then have Osebo, the leopard. For these things I will sell you the right to tell all stories. So, I mean, the stories are for sale. It's just difficult to get the three things that Nyame wants. And this is why no one so far has been able to do it. But Anansi says, yeah, I can do that for you. Not a problem. So, right off the bat, I think we should be asking ourselves, why does Anansi want the stories? Why does Anansi want control of all of the stories, the right to tell all of the stories? And one of the reasons, I think, is that stories are powerful. powerful. And Anansi is very clever, right? Anansi knows stuff. Anansi understands that tools and rhetoric and language can be used to achieve objectives. And stories are part of the way that we do that, right? We make sense of the world that we exist in through stories, and we convince others to see the world the way that we see it by telling stories. This is foundational to rhetoric, right? And so while this iteration of this folktale doesn't make this explicit, if we step back from what the text does make explicit and ask, why does Anansi want stories? I think it has to come down to that, right? Is a sort of recognition of the power of stories. And this is a folktale, right? It is meant to tell the audience things about the world and how to behave in the world. And so, I mean, it foregrounds the success of someone who is clever and can outsmart an opponent who might be bigger, stronger, more powerful, more dangerous, whatever it is. But if you can defeat them through your wits, through your ability to tell stories that will compel them to do what you want, then you can be successful, right? And this is a great lesson for a folktale to convey. And again, I think that is why Anansi wants these stories, is because whether on an intuitive level or whatever it is, I think Anansi understands that stories are powerful. And so by having them, Anansi becomes more powerful, right? Cool. I think that's really, really cool. So Anansi has to gather up these three creatures / groups of creatures, in the case of the hornets, Momboro, the hornets, Onini, the great python, Osebo, the leopard. He does this through trickery. 3 tricks. We get 3 cool stuff, right? Because Anansi is clever like that. So for the hornets, he takes a calabash and he cuts a small hole in it, right? A calabash is a gourd, hollow gourd typically. And Anansi covers himself in water and he flicks some water at the hornets. He puts the calabash on his head and he's like, it's raining. Why aren't you going inside? Go inside. And the hornets are like, where should we go? Oh no. And Anansi's like, here, go in this gourd. Look, there's a hole. It's nice and dry in there. So the hornets go in and he plugs it with grass. And he's like, what he says to them specifically is, oh yes, but you are really foolish people. And this is sort of Anansi's verdict on each of these 3 things, each of these 3 creatures or sets of creatures that he has to capture, is that they are foolish because they have fallen into his trap. So Anansi takes the hornets to Niame, and Niame says, 2 more things to go. So Anansi sets out to get Onini, the python. And what Anansi does is he pretends that he's had an argument with his wife about whether or not Onini is stronger and longer than a particular piece of bamboo. And Onini overhears this because Anansi is having the conversation for Onini to overhear. And Onini comes down and he's like, well, we'll settle this. I think I'm stronger and longer than this bamboo. I'll stretch myself out alongside it. And Anansi says, oh, you're not quite as long. And Onini stretches to try and get there. And Anansi says, when you stretch at one end, the other end gets shorter. I'll tie the ends of you to this bamboo so you can stretch more easily. So he ties Onini's head to the one end of the bamboo. He ties Onini's tail to the other end of the bamboo and just wraps him up in vines and captures Onini because He wanted to prove that he was big and powerful. And Anansi's verdict is, it turns out that my wife was right and I was wrong. You are shorter than the pole and weaker. My opinion wasn't as good as my wife's, but you were even more foolish than I, and now you are and you are now my prisoner. So Anansi takes Onini to Nyame, and Nyame says, one more creature you need to gather in order to get the rights to the stories. Osebo, the leopard. And so Anansi digs a pit trap, basically. Anansi digs a hole down and covers it with twigs and grasses and dust, whatever it is, in a place. He digs it in a place where he knows that Osebo walks. And so Osebo walks along. He does not see the trap. He falls into it. And then in the morning, Anansi comes along and says, Osebo, what are you doing in that pit? Osebo says, I'm trapped. Help get me out. And Anansi says, I'm not going to help get you out because then you'll get hungry and you'll eat me and my family. And Osebo says, I swear that I will not do that. And so Anansi says, okay, since you have sworn, I will get you out of this pit. And what he does is he pulls down a tree and he ties the end of it to the ground to hold it in place. He ties another rope to it and has Osebo tie that to his tail. You can see where this is going, right? Once Osebo has secured his tail to this tree, Anansi cuts the rope, holding it down. Osebo is pulled up by the tree into the air. He is now suspended by his tail, and Anansi kills Osebo, which I don't really approve of. As a cat owner, I don't approve of this manner of thing. I don't approve of cruelty to animals, generally speaking, but I don't like cruelty to cats in particular. But Anansi brings the body of Osebo to Nyame, and Nyame says, Kwaku Anansi, great warriors and chiefs have tried, but they have been unable to do it. You have done it. Therefore, I will give you the stories. From this day onward, all stories belong to you. Whenever a man tells a story, he must acknowledge that it is Anansi's tale. In this way, Anansi the spider became the owner of all stories that are told. To Anansi, all these tales belong. So Anansi does it, right? He succeeds where so many others of strength and power had failed. He is successful, and he becomes the owner of these stories, which again is a source of power, because being able to tell stories and being able to convince others to do what you want them to do by telling stories is a massive source of strength that one can deploy against others, whether or not that's a good thing. I also think it is striking that it is Anansi, the spider, who becomes the owner of the stories, because there is a not uncommon metaphor of weaving a story, right? Weaving a tale, right? You put together the threads of a story in much the same way that a spider weaves their web, puts together the threads of their web to create a whole out of the individual pieces. This is a sort of common folkloric trope, I think. I think Arachne in Greek mythology and folklore is also linked to storytelling, etc., right? So it makes a lot of sense here. You have a character who's very clever. You have a character who weaves together different elements to create a whole design. Anansi is the storyteller par excellence.